Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, July 18th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Mossad chief says that Netanyahu is thwarting a ceasefire deal. So Mossad Director David Barnea, the Israeli official leading indirect negotiations with Hamas, said Wednesday that one of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's latest demands may prevent a potential ceasefire and hostage deal. According to Haaretz, Barnea presented the Security Cabinet with the differences between Netanyahu and the negotiating team. He said the main problem now is Netanyahu's insistence on creating a mechanism for Israel to monitor Palestinians returning to North Gaza during a potential ceasefire. Israel had previously agreed to allow free movement of Palestinians so they could return to the north. But Netanyahu reversed that concession and publicly called for an agreement to prohibit armed men from entering the north. So Israeli security and military officials favor a ceasefire deal, as I've been going over. And this is significant because this is the head of Mossad, who has been tasked with leading these negotiations. He's been meeting with Egyptian and Qatari officials and William Burns, the head of the CIA. And he's now saying, what is the main impediment to a deal? It's Netanyahu. And another interesting thing happened on Wednesday. Members of the ultra-Orthodox Shah's party called on Netanyahu to reach a deal with Hamas and to ignore members of the government threatening to quit, which includes National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. The Shah's party, which is in the Netanyahu coalition, they said, quote, "We believe that the conditions created now following the appreciated military pressure and targeted killings create an appropriate time to reach a deal that preserves Israel's vital security interests and brings the hostages home." End quote. So they continued referring to Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. They said Netanyahu should, quote, "not fear the voices within the coalition who oppose the deal and encourage you to continue to act responsibly for the sake of the mitzvah of redeeming captives," end quote. So there's also two Likud ministers who called for an agreement with Hamas on Wednesday as well, including the Science and Technology Minister, Gila Gamliel. She said, quote, "There is no reason why this deal should not go through. Smotrich's threats, for that, he should have been fired immediately. The very threat should have caused him to go home," end quote. So I know the Netanyahu government has 64 seats in the Knesset, which is 120. If Ben-Gvir quit and Smotrich quit, he would lose the majority, and that could force elections. I know Lapid, the leader of the opposition, has said he would bail Netanyahu out for a hostage deal. So you have Netanyahu increasingly standing on his own against the ceasefire deal. Netanyahu and these very extremist elements of his government. It doesn't matter to the U.S. apparently, because they continue to give him whatever he wants. They're sending those 500-pound bombs now, and Netanyahu's going to receive a nice warm welcome in D.C. Next week. He's going to meet with Biden and address Congress. I'm sure there's going to be big protests outside, but Congress and the White House probably going to give him a nice warm welcome. In the meantime, Israel continues to pound the Gaza Strip. Gaza's health ministry said Wednesday that 81 Palestinians were killed by Israeli strikes in the previous 24-hour period. One attack targeted a UN-run school turned shelter for civilians in the Nusret camp. So that has been happening quite frequently. They've been targeting these schools. All right, so the next one here, Israeli lawmakers vote against Palestinian statehood. This article is from Common Dreams. They must have had a late vote because this only broke a couple hours ago. So Israeli lawmakers on Wednesday voted overwhelmingly in favor of a resolution opposing the establishment of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. So from the river to the sea, there will be no Palestine, the Israeli Knesset is saying here. And this measure passed the legislature in a vote of 68 to 9. Some lawmakers sat out of the vote, but only 9 voted against it. And it was spearheaded by Knesset member Zeev Elkin of New Hope, the United Right. So the resolution said, quote, "The Israeli Knesset firmly opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan. The establishment of a Palestinian state in the heart of the land of Israel will pose an existential threat to the state of Israel and its citizens, perpetuate the conflict, and destabilize the region. It will only be a matter of short time until Hamas takes over the Palestinian state and turns it into a base of radical Islamic terrorism, working in coordination with the Axis led by Iran to eliminate the state of Israel," end quote. So this is a big deal because if you remember, it was a couple months ago, the Knesset passed, again, overwhelmingly, a resolution that was basically drafted by Netanyahu that said Israel opposes unilateral attempts to essentially impose a Palestinian state on Israel. And that was a response to the U.S. and these Arab countries talking about this post-war Gaza plan that included establishing a Palestinian state. So that resolution, again, the language was saying that they would oppose a unilateral Palestinian state. This is just rejecting altogether the idea of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. So this hasn't happened before, you know, and we've known for a long time the two-state solution is dead, but this is making it official. And again, this happens right before Netanyahu heads to Washington, and you've had Biden and Blinken and Sullivan all saying, oh, you know, we need a two-state solution when this thing's over. That's what we're working towards, even though it's been clear Netanyahu and most of the Israeli government, Knesset, doesn't want it, but they're still living in this fantasy land, or they're just lying, this idea that this is something that could happen. So again, it's just that visit next week. It's going to be some stuff that comes out of that. All right, so the next one here, the Pentagon officially ends Gaza Pier operations. This one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. A temporary floating pier that was intended to bring food and other aid into Gaza has been officially terminated, according to the Pentagon. While the White House is touting the operation as a success, it cost hundreds of millions of dollars and provided only a trickle of aid to desperate Palestinians. So this was the thing that Biden ordered during his State of the Union address in March. Instead of pressuring Israel to allow more aid to enter through the border crossings, he ordered this elaborate plan to build this pier. It cost somewhere between $260 and $320 million. It only operated for 20 days. It broke apart at one point. It couldn't handle rough seas. It was just a complete disaster. Yet the Pentagon is essentially saying in the press conference on this, they said, oh, you know, we've completed the mission. Mission accomplished. And just a complete joke. But it is officially over now. All right, so the next one here, death toll for journalists hit 160 in Gaza. This is another one from Kyle. And when I was going over this before, I remembered that I actually think I mentioned this yesterday in kind of one of the stories about the summary of the Israeli strikes that hit Gaza on Tuesday. But I think it's good to highlight the death of the journalists in Gaza, because we just haven't talked about that in a while. The death count for Palestinian journalists in Gaza has hit 160 as Israeli forces continue to target civilians throughout the Strip. The mass killing of reporters has shrouded the true devastation caused by the Israeli bombing campaign. And they're also not letting foreign journalists in. They let CNN in there at one point, and they had a good report that was very critical of Israel. They also had another one about how Israel was destroying cemeteries in Gaza, just desecrating the dead there, and you know, on a very large scale. I forget the number, but they were just destroying like all the cemeteries for no like apparent reason, like besides just wanting to destroy them. Anyway, so this was Mohammed Abdullah Mash, according to Gaza's media office. He was killed on Tuesday in an Israeli strike on a UN-run school at the Nusret refugee camp, the 160th journalist to be killed. All right, so the next one here, letters from Gaza children decry daily horrors of Israeli assault. So this one is from Brett Wilkins, a UK-based humanitarian group on Tuesday delivered heartbreaking letters from 2 Palestinian girls, including one who lost her arm in an Israeli attack, imploring new Labor Prime Minister Keir Starmer to intervene and help bring about a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. So this is 15-year-old Mais Abdel Hadi. She said, quote, "We write to you with hearts full of sorrow and spirits crushed by the daily suffering inflicted upon us by the brutal war. We live in a constant state of fear and anxiety, with shells accompanying us around the clock, reaping lives, sparing only those fortunate enough to survive. Destruction and devastation surrounded us on all sides. Our question is, why must we children pay such a horrendous price?" End quote. And then the other, this number here, according to Gaza's health ministry, an average of 58 children have been killed each day, approximately 16,000 in total. I mean, 58 children per day, and the things that they have to live through here. The other girl, 16-year-old Hala Abu Salim, she is one of the thousands of child amputees. She said, quote, "Will my hand grow back, or am I condemned to live without an arm? I am not a terrorist to be exterminated. I am not a terrorist for my house to be destroyed and my family killed. I am not a terrorist to live in a tent that is scorching during the day and freezing at night, unfit even for animals," end quote. You see this picture here. You just see the lower half of this child, but it looks like a toddler with amputated legs. Man. All right, the next one here. Gaza father mourns his baby boy killed in bed by an Israeli airstrike. I know this has these are some depressing stories that we're going over here, but this article's from AP, and we've seen them doing this lately, kind of highlighting just one death, of one child in the grieving family, because, we talk about these numbers all the time, but, you think every dead child is a tragedy for that family, and these stories just make it seem much more real, and these pictures to see this father holding this kid who's not even 2 years old, who was killed by an Israeli airstrike in bed. The dead Palestinian toddler's limbs were pale and cold despite the sweltering summer heat in Gaza. Outside the hospital, his father cradled the boy in his arms, unable or unwilling to say goodbye. Flies circled and landed in the child's soft hair. His son, Yamin, was killed by an Israeli airstrike. Israeli strikes killed more than 60 Palestinians in southern and central Gaza from Monday night into Tuesday, according to hospital records. So these were those strikes from Monday into Tuesday, and they killed this kid instantly, and he was not yet 2 years old. So just complete horror show in Gaza. All right, so the next one here. China stops arms control talks with the U.S. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said Wednesday that Beijing had stopped arms control talks with the U.S. over continued U.S. arms sales to Taiwan and other steps that go against China's core interests. The U.S. and China held consultations on arms control back in November 2023. A reporter asked Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Zhan about comments from U.S. officials suggesting that China declined to hold another round. He said, quote, "Over the past weeks and months, despite China's firm opposition and repeated protests, the U.S. has continued to sell arms to Taiwan and done things that severely undermine China's core interests and the mutual trust between China and the U.S. This has seriously compromised the political atmosphere for continuing the arms control consultations. Consequently, the Chinese side has decided to hold off discussion with the U.S., end quote. He goes on to say China's ready for arms control talks. If the U.S. shows mutual respect and respects China's core interests, as he puts it. And I know some people might be thinking here, well, hasn't the U.S. always sold weapons to Taiwan? And it is true that they have since the 70s when they opened up with China. But things are different now today than they have been, over the past few decades. And really, they're different now than they were 10 years ago. All this new support that we've seen, U.S. support for Taiwan, including lots and lots of arms sales and military aid and diplomatic support. And China has been warning, over the past couple of years very firmly, as they call it, as Xi Jinping has said to President Biden, Taiwan is the first red line in U.S.-China relations that must not be crossed. And the U.S. has not been listening to those warnings, and they continue to ramp up the support for Taiwan. Since those arms control talks were held in November 2023, we have had several U.S. arms sales to Taiwan approved by the State Department, and the big $95 billion foreign military aid bill that included military aid for Taiwan. So China is not happy about all this stuff. All right, so the next one here, Trump says that Taiwan should pay the U.S. for its defense. So former President Trump, the Republican Party's presidential nominee, told Bloomberg in an interview published on Tuesday that Taiwan should pay the U.S. to defend the island, and compared the idea to an insurance policy. President Biden has vowed several times that he would intervene to defend Taiwan in the event of an attack, breaking from the decades-long U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity on the issue. So I put kind of the whole quote in here for context, most of it, of what he's saying here, because I feel like it was kind of misrepresented what he said. And it's funny because on one hand, you see like the neocons, the hawks are freaking out about him saying, oh, they got to pay for us to defend them. But he's not ruling out the idea of the U.S. defending Taiwan. But he says some kind of interesting things. And Trump, I kind of avoided like covering his foreign policy comments for a while. But now that the election's getting closer, because it's just so hard to know really what he's going to do. And but I think we should kind of start covering this stuff a little more. And Taiwan is something I want to focus more on in general. So he was asked if he would defend Taiwan, and Trump said, quote, look, a couple of things. Number one, Taiwan, I know the people very well, respect them greatly. They did take about 100% of our chip business. I think Taiwan should pay us for defense. We're no different than an insurance company. Taiwan doesn't give us anything. Taiwan is 9,500 miles away. It's 68 miles away from China, a slight advantage, and China's a massive piece of land. They could just bombard it. They don't even need to. I mean, they can literally just send shells. Now they don't want to do that because they don't want to lose all those chip plants, end quote. So during his time in office, President Biden oversaw an increase in U.S. support for Taiwan that ramped up tensions between the U.S. and China. And President Biden continued boosting ties with Taiwan. And he continued Trump's overall tough on China policy, including the trade war with the tariffs. So Trump suggested to Bloomberg that tensions would not be so high if he remained in office, saying, quote, the day I left, they sent 28 bombers right over the top, and they've been very aggressive ever since. They got ships all over the place, end quote. So it sounds like he's talking about the Chinese military flights in Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which is not Taiwan's airspace. It gets misreported as that often. And their air defense identification zone extends far beyond, the coastal waters of Taiwan. It actually goes over mainland China, but of course they don't report those flights. But these flights he's talking about, usually they're pretty far from Taiwan. They have, gotten closer recently, but these really started in 2020 under Trump, when he sent his health secretary, this was August 2020, Alex Azar, and then the following month he sent an undersecretary for economic development or something like that to Taiwan, and that's when we really saw China ramp up these flights, and then they did dramatically increase under Biden, especially when Nancy Pelosi went over to Taiwan. Then they started flying across the median line, which separates the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, kind of getting closer and closer. We saw those huge drills around Taiwan. So things certainly have really escalated under Biden, but this really started, the what they call the pivot to Asia started under Obama. The stuff with Taiwan, like kind of this new diplomatic stuff, really started under Trump. And actually, he started it before he was even president. If you remember in 2016, or maybe it was in 2017 in January, but after Trump was elected, it was probably 2016. Anyway, after he was elected, he accepted a phone call from Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, which is not something that, they usually do. So that was a message there of how his administration would be toward China. So Trump reiterated in the interview that defending Taiwan would be very hard for the U.S., but he did not rule it out. He said, quote, I just think we have to be smart, but remember, 9,500 miles away, end quote. All right, so the next one here, Germany plans to slash Ukraine's spending in half. So Germany is planning to cut its spending on military aid for Ukraine in half next year, and is telling Kiev to look elsewhere for more funding. So according to Germany's draft budget for 2025, Berlin will bring its spending on Ukraine to 4 billion euros, down from 8 billion euros. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was initially reluctant to arm Ukraine and initially resisted sending heavy weapons such as tanks, citing the risk of World War III. But he eventually agreed, and Germany has become the top supplier of weapons to Ukraine in Europe. The draft budget still needs to be finalized and could face some resistance in Parliament, but Scholz's government appears pretty set on making the cuts to cover other costs. And another issue for Germany is that they've depleted much of their stockpiles. Germany's finance minister said that Ukraine would have to rely on funding from other European sources, including this $50 billion that they want to give them using the frozen Russian assets. That hasn't been finalized yet, but that's what he's kind of pointing to. So still interesting to see Germany, again, the top supplier in Europe, surpass the UK, cutting their Ukraine budget in half. Maybe they are expecting that this thing might wind down next year. All right, so the next one here, NATO appoints a senior official to represent the alliance in Ukraine. So on Wednesday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced the alliance was appointing a senior official to represent its interests in Ukraine. This was one of the commitments made during the NATO summit, and they are sending Patrick Turner, a British official who has served in various roles in NATO. This is really kind of a symbolic thing that they're doing to say, you know, they can't actually invite Ukraine to join NATO, so they're doing things like this. At the same time, it goes to show the attitude, I think, from the higher levels of the NATO alliance is like, you know, we want to send a message that we're not gonna that we're gonna keep this proxy war going, even though there are signs that, like Germany, Zelensky saying Russia should go to the peace summit. You know, stuff J.D. Vance has said, there are signs that this thing might, let's hope that it winds down next year. All right, so the last story here, hawks want Mike Pompeo and Tom Cotton in the Trump administration. So Politico had a report on Wednesday about J.D. Vance being selected to be Trump's running mate, and about how a lot of the neocons and the more hawkish Republicans are not happy about it. And they have some ideas of how to counterbalance him. So the more hawkish wing of the Republican Party is hoping former President Donald Trump will put ultra-hawks in prominent positions in his cabinet if he's elected for a second term, as a counterbalance to Senator J.D. Vance being picked as vice president. Vance being chosen by Trump has alarmed many Republicans due to his opposition of the proxy war in Ukraine. One influential GOP member of Congress told Politico, quote, "I'm scared to death," end quote. The report said Republican hawks hope to see Mike Pompeo, Trump's former CIA director and Secretary of State, as the Secretary of Defense. So that is bad news. Let's hope they don't get their way, because Pompeo was pretty much the worst person in the Trump administration. I mean, you had you had John Bolton, but he didn't last very long. Pompeo was there until the end, and him and Trump never had any kind of falling out. So I have feared that he would end up in the next Trump administration. Let's hope that doesn't happen. You know, he's a hawk on everything. The worst thing about him was that his CIA plotted to kidnap, and they discussed assassinating Julian Assange. He was the head of the CIA when the Vault 7 documents were published by WikiLeaks, which detailed CIA hacking and spying tools, and that infuriated the CIA, and they started plotting, you know, the worst when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. And I think that anger within, you know, Pompeo declared, I forget exactly what he called it, but WikiLeaks like a hostile foreign intelligence service or something. And I think that momentum led to the DOJ indicting Assange and going after him, even though it was for something completely unrelated. You know, it was for the Iraq, Afghanistan war logs, for those releases, the State Department cables. But that certainly played a big part in it. So another person who was mentioned for a top role is Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas. Again, hawkish on everything, up there with Lindsey Graham. And they're talking about him heading the CIA or having a position in the White House. And in the White House, that could mean being the national security advisor, the head of the National Security Council, which I don't even want to think about that. So again, hopefully these hawks don't get their way. And then I get into a little bit of the stuff about Vance here. So Vance became a leading critic of aid to Ukraine when he entered the Senate about a year and a half ago. In an interview with the New York Times, he outlined a potential way to end the war, although he left open the possibility of limited military assistance to Kiev. This was last month before he was picked. He said, quote, "What I would like to do and what I think fundamentally is achievable here with American leadership is you freeze the territorial lines somewhere close to where they are right now. That's number one. Number two, you guarantee both Kiev's independence, but also its neutrality. It's the fundamental thing the Russians have asked from the beginning. I'm not naive here. I think the Russians have asked for a lot of things dishonestly, but neutrality is clearly something that they see as an existential for them. And then three, there's going to have to be some American security assistance over the long term. I think those three things are certainly achievable. Yes," end quote. So he's saying the U.S. has to keep providing Ukraine with some sort of military assistance. This Politico report about this, portrayed Vance as an isolationist, and a non-interventionist, which is not the case. He's hawkish on Iran and China, as we went over yesterday. But just the fact that he is, wants to end this proxy war in Ukraine, it's good to see at least, the neocons and the real hawkish members of the party are freaking out about him. But unfortunately, he says, we got to wind down in Ukraine to focus on China, which could be the next big disaster. He said in that New York Times interview, quote, "The thing that we can control now is making it costly for them to invade Taiwan. And we're not doing that because we're sending all those damn weapons to Ukraine and not Taiwan," end quote. So he's not saying don't send weapons to anybody. He's saying send those weapons to Taiwan. Send them to Israel. So we'll see how this all plays out. But, let's hope. Hopefully, I know there's some Republicans who listen to this. Say no to Tom Cotton. Say no to Mike Pompeo. Make it very clear that you do not want to see them in the next Trump administration. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. One from Andrew Corbley, would the president be in charge during a war in Taiwan? One from Rick Sterling, 170 years of U.S. aggression against Nicaragua. One from Philip Weiss, Israel is falling apart and American leaders are in denial. One from Doug Bandow, it is time to shut Ukraine's door to NATO. And one from Dan Grazer, Julia Gledhill, and Jeff Wilson, current defense plans require unsustainable future spending. So that is it. I went through things kind of quickly because I did the whole show and then I lost power for a little while because we have thunderstorms here, so I had to restart it. But anyway, but if you want to support us, tell your friends about antiwar.com, share this show, like, subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, wherever you prefer to watch. If you listen to the podcast, leave a rating or a review if you can. Follow us on X, Instagram, all that good stuff. I'll be back tomorrow. One more show this week. Thanks for listening.